Hey guys, welcome to the first lecture on colonialism and the American Revolution. My name is Mr. Turner, and I am presenting this lecture for my IB history class. Our first real unit, we're going to dig down deep into the American Revolution, and we're going to talk a lot about the myths behind the Revolution, how popular memory often differs with historical facts. So all those good things. We'll talk about what led to the war itself. We'll talk about the fighting, the major battles, the theaters of war. We'll also talk about the impact that it left on America, both in terms of our cultural memory, but also on our political landscape. So, a couple of reminders for my IB history students that are going to be watching this. Please make sure that you are taking notes while you watch. You're following along, and also jotting down questions in the margins of your notes. Please make sure you get those to me. Email me, post on a discussion board if you need to, but please make sure you do get those questions to me during this whole virtual learning phase. I know it's not easy. It's often kind of getting, one-sided, and trust me, I miss our discussions. So please, if you have any questions at all, do not hesitate to contact me and let me know what those questions are. Well, let's go ahead and get started here. Let's talk about, first of all, the unit itself. We are going to begin with colonialism. We're actually going to begin by talking about what revolution actually means. So, we just got done with our historiography mini unit, and we talked about how, history itself does not change, but how we talk about history often changes. And that's going to play into our lecture today. So, again, there's a lot of myths surrounding the American Revolution, a lot of things that we kind of have this common history, or at least we think, especially with the founding fathers, some of their beliefs, what did they actually believe? This is the unit, we're going to get into some of that. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoy. Let's go ahead and get the screen rolling here. Make sure that we are all set up. All right, excellent. So colonialism and the American Revolution. Let's get rolling. Okay, so part one, we will break up this lecture series into two parts. The first being the causes of the war, and then the second part being the fighting the war itself. So I always like to begin by talking about that word revolution. So we always call this the American Revolution. But that really depends on your definition. And your definition really depends on your time and place. We're going to look at how the word revolution has been applied to historical events in the past. And I think you'll very obviously see that the definition of revolution has changed quite a bit over the last 200 years. And perhaps it's worthy of debate whether the American Revolution was truly revolutionary or not. So anyways, we'll get into that. Usually in class, we'd be having a big discussion about this. But again, we'll have to kind of form our own opinions, and you'll have to either email me or put it in a discussion post. So, the idea of what makes a revolution. Like I said, this has completely changed. What is it actually defining? Is it simply a change in leadership? Is it a change in political structure? Is it a change in societal structure? What we really kind of base our modern day examples of revolution on, when we say there's a revolution happening in, some Southeast Asian country or whatnot, what is it that's actually taking place? Well, a lot of times our revolution's kind of based off more recent historical revolution, the Russian Revolution, which completely upended things, French Revolution. But to go back, does the American Revolution really look like those others? We'll get into this point here. So, first of all, one of the first times we see the word revolution being applied to a historical event is actually with the English Civil War. So back in the late 1600s, in England, you had, the Civil War breakout that was, the revolution itself was really purely political. All right, it was a political revolution that occurred, and we won't get too much into the event itself, but basically you had the Whigs in Britain They're the ones that are kind of defining this revolution. But there was this fight over, how the government should be set up. This constitutional monarchy on one side, and those arguing for absolute monarchy on the other side. So the Whigs had supported what was called the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which brought over William of Orange, who was Dutch, to support basically a civilian Bill of Rights and to kind of roll back some of the absolute power of the king. So in that sense, the Whigs said that is revolutionary, and to them it was. And that's the biggest point I want you to take away from this, is that when the word revolution is applied, regardless of how radical it actually is, usually it is apt for that time and place. So, here for the Whigs, it was revolutionary. The idea that the king would be limited in his power, that the people, civilians, would actually have some rights that the king had to recognize, that is revolutionary for those people at that time and place. It was a new idea. And so this is something that truly was revolutionary, to have a constitutional structure of government. But this is a very pre-French Revolution view of revolution as well. You don't have immense social upheaval, right? This is really just purely political, how your government is organized. So let's move down to the Jacobin definition. Now, for my IB students, I know last year in world history, you guys studied the French Revolution, hopefully in depth. So, during the French Revolution, you had some extreme violence, right? I mean, they were literally lining people up that were enemies of the state, so-called, quote unquote. And I mean, they were executing them in the street. They were executing, the clergy. They were literally executing the king himself. So this was a violent revolution, one of which we've never seen the likes of up to that point. Now, the revolution in France, it upended everything about society, everything about politics there. I mean, literally, they killed the king, right? I mean, this is not a debate on, well, should it be an absolute monarch or a constitutional monarch? No, we're killing the king. He's gone, all right? So this is a completely different, more radicalized view of what a revolution actually is. But also, it overthrew the entire estate system, right? So, again, you were kind of born into a certain estate in some aspects. It was very difficult to move. There was very little social mobility. So, what that revolution did was really destroy the social fabric in France. Truly, truly revolutionary, especially for that time. It makes the Whig definition during the English Civil War look fairly weak, right? But again, we just said that, at that time and place, that was a revolutionary act. So it was kind of apt for that time and place. This would go on even further, with the Russian Revolution, of course, where you had the economic system being completely overturned as well. That's explored a little bit in Crane Britton's book, The Anatomy of Revolution. This book was published in 1938, and it does kind of analyze by comparing four major revolutions as to, what causes these revolutions to take place, what exactly they mean by revolutions, but, they have different, impacts that they have. Some just purely political, some social, some economic, some all three. The point I'm getting to here is that the definition of revolution is completely dependent on one's time and place. All right. The American Revolution, some would argue, was revolutionary. It cut us off from the king. It set up this government, at least initially, with the Articles of Confederation. We try to forget about that little phase. But, it set us up with, where the states were kind of, individual, almost countries in some sense, trying to limit any kind of federal look at all. So at the time, they're saying, that's a radical, revolutionary change. Today, though, applying today's standards, it doesn't really seem to fit that. But again, at the time and place, it did. One comment, one quote that I want to take you through before we'll move on to the next point here is a letter that John Adams wrote, and this was after the war had concluded. In his later years, he and Jefferson exchanged numerous letters at the end of their lives, which is, I've always loved this relationship because when they were both politicians, they really despised one another. I mean, they did not agree on many issues, and later on in their political careers really separate. I mean, really didn't talk. But in their later years, in retirement, they actually exchanged a ton of letters between the two men, and very, very interesting viewpoints, and very, well, let's just say some of the letters are very straightforward, and they tell you everything about their views. And anyways, getting off topic here. Let's listen to what John Adams had to say about the revolution itself. Listen to this. Quote, "The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and their obligations. This radical change in the principles, the opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution." So, what does that mean? Well, what John Adams is saying here, that first part where he says the revolution was effected before the war commenced, before the war even started. He said the revolution had taken place. Well, what is the revolution then? Right? We always say the Revolutionary War. Well, he's saying the revolution already concluded. What Adams is saying is that the people had made up their mind that they weren't going to put up with this anymore, that they were not going to allow a king, a tyrant, 3,000 miles away. And we'll talk later on about how much King George actually played into this. Really, Parliament was the issue for the most part. But anyways, they had made up their mind. They were not going to allow a government 3,000 miles away who continued to bar any kind of active they were not allowed to participate at all in Parliament, and I always go back to this one idea of how everything, literally all world history would differ had Parliament simply allowed us a representative. But they refused. Adams says here that, listen, the revolution took place well before any fighting actually started, well before, bloodshed actually occurred. The previous decade gave us all the reason that we needed to revolt. And so the war was just kind of a byproduct of the actual revolution in Adams' mind. So let's talk about those years leading up to the war itself, because that really, if we're to believe Adams, that itself is the actual revolution, not just the fighting. I always like to point out maps because this explains so much of our story. You can see here kind of a map that's highlighting the major countries that are involved by this point. We're getting into the 17th century and to the 18th century. You can see there's a number of countries that have taken land claims, and you'll notice that Britain actually has some of the smallest territory, right? The 13 colonies, excuse me. The 13 colonies, in terms of land area, are actually some of the smallest claims. Spain even has more land area total. Now, granted, the value of the land, Britain definitely had the more valuable of the land, with all the coastline, with the rich timber, all the resources there. For the most part, Spain, this is the northern part of their empire, and really you're getting into a lot of desert area. There's just not as many people even. So yes, they had more land, but in terms of resources, just not as important as what Britain had. But notice France. Look at the lock that France has right there in the middle of the country. Middle of the continent, I should say. Now, one big difference here that I want to establish, and you'll cover in your reading, is that France and Britain had really two different perspectives on colonization, or at least the purpose of colonization. France is going to be sending in a lot of fur traders to go into these areas, trade with Native Americans, but trap fur and then sell those pelts back home. And that was a very lucrative empire. But the British are here to stay, right? They are setting up population centers. They're setting up villages that'll turn into towns, that'll turn into cities, that'll turn into states. So, what you have is a difference in kind of just colonial philosophy, right? So they're all about making money, right? That's kind of the end goal for most of these colonies. But the French are not really populating this area as much as the British. So by the time we get to the French and Indian War, that's going to play a big role in this. So I always like to start with the map because it explains so much of the history of what we're about to encounter. So again, the British, just controlling those 13 colonies at the point where our story really kicks off, really butted up against French territory, and they're bitter enemies. I mean, the French and the British have just been constantly fighting back and forth for hundreds of years at this point. All right, so before we get to that fighting between Britain and France, I did want to get into the philosophy of this, kind of along the lines of what John Adams was mentioning. And we're going to talk about a couple of the philosophers of the age that made some tremendous impacts, both on the founding father figures, but also on society in general. And usually in our historiography unit, we go more in depth with this, but obviously with kind of our shortened format, didn't have time to do that. So let's talk about John Locke just for a second. John Locke is going to publish a very important book in 1689 called The Two Treatises of Government. Okay, Two Treatises of Government. And in this, and perhaps I should back up and explain that, first of all, this age that we are in, that we are talking about, is called the Age of Enlightenment. Right, the Age of Enlightenment. You might remember that from your world history course. That this, was an age in which people are questioning. They are, questioning the traditions of both politics and economics, but just even the purpose of life. They're questioning things like religion. So this Age of Enlightenment, the American Revolution, in a lot of ways, is kind of the culmination of this Age of Enlightenment, where philosophers have much bigger roles in societies than, in some ways, even politicians themselves. So John Locke is writing in 1689, and he writes in this Two Treatises of Government some pretty profound statements. All right, the first one that you need to know is he talks about what's called natural law. Okay, natural law. He says that men, and I'm going to use that phrase men, of course he's referring to all people, okay, but that is how they spoke at the time. Men are subject, even in a state of nature, to basically natural law or kind of God's law, all right? Most of these men, including John Locke himself, he actually wrote a number of what are called deist philosophies. A number of the founding fathers were deists. They, believed in a creator God, but often had questions about, the revelations to mankind, and questioned some of the, more supernatural elements of Christianity. But John Locke was one of these, and he wrote extensively on that subject. So he says, God has created, what's called natural law, which says that even in a state of nature, we know what's right and wrong, right? We know in the back of our head, even if we had been born in complete isolation, we know that there are certain things that are right, certain things that are wrong. It's wrong to steal. It is wrong to murder, right? We know deep down it is wrong to murder. That is natural law, according to John Locke. And the reason that we all know this is because we have reasoned it, right? Logically, it makes sense. Murder is wrong. That kind of violence inflicting upon another human being is wrong. And saying that this becomes known through our own logic and reason. We don't have to be told murder is wrong. We know it, all right? So that's kind of the first major point. There is a natural law that John Locke believes kind of governs everyone, all right? Now, he takes that kind of a step further, and he says there are natural rights that we all have, right? So we have this natural law established. There are natural rights that men possess. And he says the most basic of those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of, I know a lot of you just said happiness, but it's actually property. What John Locke said was that we have natural rights, and they are the pursuit of life, liberty, and property. We'll talk about the switching of phrases later on. You can thank Thomas Jefferson for that. But life, liberty, and property. So these are the natural rights. We have the right to life, right? No one should be able to take our life from us. We have the right to liberty. We exist in a free state, right? And so those who look to confine our liberty are violating our natural rights, and also the right to property. Now that property part, property ownership, to Locke, he believed. In fact, let me read you a little quote here. He said, "The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths," and commonwealths is kind of a term for governments. He's saying, so the main reason that we enter into governments and put themselves under government is the preservation of their property. All right, so he says this is the whole reason governments exist, is to protect our natural rights and to protect, to secure our property. All right, well, think about this mentality, right? This philosophy that is the whole reason governments exist, is to secure some kind of preservation of property. So he's not saying that government has this role to better our lives in any way, or to become intrusive in our lives in any way, but it has to be able to protect us at its most basic levels: life, liberty, and property. If it's not doing that, if it's impeding on our any of our natural rights, he would suggest that we have the right to overthrow that. And that's kind of the third point that John Locke makes. He says that natural rights are inalienable, okay, unable to be taken away. And therefore, and this is the key, if a ruler fails to respect natural rights, John Locke says we have a right to revolution. Okay? A right to revolution. Let me read you just a little bit more here, and this is from John Locke, and I think this kind of covers the whole point. This is a quote, "Whenever the legislatures endeavored to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any farther obedience, and are left to the common refuge which God hath provided for all men against force and violence. Whensoever therefore the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption endeavor to grasp themselves or put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by this breach of trust they forfeit their power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty." So, what does that mean? What John Locke is saying here is that when the government oversteps their bounds, they have violated the social contract between people and the government. We are the ones who give government its power. It's not the other way around. The government does not dispose. Is that right? Dispose. The government does not give us our rights. We have rights. They are inalienable. They are undeniable. Right? These are natural rights. No government on earth can give you your rights. Okay? These are things that we already have, and the government's job is to secure those. If they're not doing it, and in fact, if they're going even further and denying you those natural rights, you have the right to overthrow that government. So again, this is saying that God's law, natural rights, is supreme to man's law. Now, this takes into account, I should mention, if you go on, it says that John Locke says this should not, this right to revolution, as he calls it, it is not something that should be, taken up upon with the slightest offense, right? There are going to be violations of rights from time to time, but that does not mean you should overthrow the government just any time there's the slightest offense. And I think Locke recognized that for the most part, people are conservative. Right? People don't really like change that much. It scares them. And so for the most part, generally, people throughout history tend to be conservative. They want to keep the status quo. Okay? And sometimes that's the right thing to do. Other times, it is not. Okay? So John Locke is saying that when these governments overstep their bounds, violate our rights, natural law, that we have not only the right, but really the duty to overthrow that government. Now, let's move on to the next Enlightenment philosopher, and that is David Hume. A little bit different take than John Locke, but he was very influential to the founding fathers, in particular Benjamin Franklin, who will even change some of the most famous phrasing in U.S. history to fall in line with Hume's philosophy. So David Hume was an Enlightenment philosopher who based his ideas, again, off of reason and observation. All right, so a lot of these guys said, listen, you can just sit there and just through observations of history, of society today, you can make a lot of logical conclusions. And, for these men, they said that is what, God gave us a mind to do, is to try and find, reason and logic in society. Now, Hume was a little bit more conservative than Locke. He said that resistance to the government should really only be reserved for extraordinary emergencies. For instance, when the public is in immediate danger of violence or tyranny, that is when revolution is okay. Locke is saying that not minor offenses, but offenses give you reason. That constitutes a reason to overthrow the government. Hume's saying it really needs to be more extreme than that before you resist. And he goes on and he says, listen, society often creates the tyranny that they seek to avoid. I want to say that again because here we are. This is September 2020. I feel like I see this a lot, right? Sometimes we create the tyranny that we seek to avoid. It's a very tense time in America today. And, I'll see posts on the internet, on Twitter, I'll see, even politicians talking about civil war. I tell you, the fear of a civil war happening today in 2020, I fear that those that fear civil war are actually going to be the ones to create the civil war. It's funny how we often do that. David Hume recognized that back in the 18th century. We have to be careful to avoid creating the tyranny that we seek to avoid. So he would be critical of Locke and said, if you're overthrowing the government, simple, intrusions on rights, you're going to have more tyranny as a result, because it is not often peaceful transitions when you change governments. It is often going to lead to, much more tyrannical actions. Civil war tends to occur in Hume's mind when there's disobedience and then the rulers have to take violent measures. So just he would probably say protests today, you have the right to protest, but eventually if those protests become too violent, the government will have to step in and put those down, which creates the tyranny in his mind. So again, I'm not here to say what's right and wrong, but Hume's saying that we have to just be careful. Right? You don't want to create the tyranny that you are really seeking to avoid. Now, the nature of the British government, the Constitution, and kind of the form of government at the time, tended to make resistance more frequent. Simpler governments, and by simple, I don't necessarily mean better. I mean simpler, like absolute sovereignty with fewer moving parts. Right? When the king is the only one that is setting forth the law, it's simpler. It's not better. There's more violations of rights, but it is definitely simpler. So, with fewer moving parts, there's less temptation to commit tyranny, he says, Hume believes, that may provoke rebellion. Free societies have the ability to protest, and I want to make sure this is clear. Those societies that we see even today where it lacks protest, or even in our own society, when it lacks protest, that doesn't mean that it's perfect, or it doesn't mean that it's a peaceful society. Sometimes those nations where people don't have the right to protest have the most tyranny of all, of course. So, I think we've gotten to the point where we look at protest as, a threat. And we got to be careful with that because, of course, no one should condone violence, the burning of cities and murder. I mean, all of these, the violent aspects of protest should be condemned by people on every side of the political spectrum. But the right to protest is a fundamental right of all Americans. And Locke and Hume would say it's beyond that. It's a fundamental right of all people ever. And if we are denying that, if governments are denying that, that is tyranny. So we have to preserve the right to protest, even if we disagree with what those protests are about. That is perhaps one of the most American sentiments that we could have. I mentioned earlier about Hume's impact on Benjamin Franklin. He would actually change Jefferson's wording. When the Declaration of Independence was being written, the men were going back and forth. There was a small committee made of Franklin. Jefferson was the main artist or the main writer in that. I believe Adams was also playing a part in the Declaration of Independence. So there are about 4 guys that were writing the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson being the main architect there. Jefferson had included some of Locke's ideas in the Declaration, and he actually had written the phrase, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Okay, now you might not recognize that phrasing, but that was the first draft. We hold these truths, these comments we're about to make about the relationship between America and Britain, the comments about people versus government. He said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Franklin said, let's be careful with that phrasing, sacred. It almost has this divine authority associated with that. And he said it's simpler than that. And this is Hume speaking through Franklin. He said, let's change it to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That is more in line with natural law. That is more in line with natural rights. So that is rooted in reason. Okay, it's nothing being granted to us by a supernatural deity. It is something that we can see, that we can reason and use logic to understand. So rooted in really scientific revolution instead of religious belief. Let's move on. Let's talk about the so-called loosening ties. So how did we get to the point where, mid 1700s, we are, just sweet little obedient colonists and, to all of a sudden, having a bloody war and completely separating really within the period of about 20 years. All right. How did we go from that, from such extremes? Well, you have to go back and look at the history that led up to it. First of all, in England, there was a lot of turbulence going on in England itself. Very turbulent time. That English Civil War I mentioned before happened in 1644. Oliver Cromwell will take over, and really he was a tyrant. I mean, he was a dictator for all intents and purposes. And after he, they even executed the king in 1649. The monarchy would later... By the way, English, they decided that Cromwell, dictatorship really wasn't their thing. So, after Cromwell is sent off, in 1660, they actually restore the monarchy under Charles II. And it's at this point that we start to see American colonies shape up. Charles II was not the best king. In fact, there was a lot of corruption that happened under Charles II. But Charles would begin to issue new colonies to basically political allies, to people, in fact, in some cases, he just simply owed debts to. He basically gave these people free land. They gave them charters over in the New World. William Penn, for example, of course, of Pennsylvania. But Charles II is issuing a lot of these charters for new colonies to his political allies, his friends. New Netherlands would be given to Charles' younger brother, the Duke of York. Eventually, that would become New York. William Penn, as I mentioned, was given land that became Pennsylvania. William Penn's father had been owed a tremendous amount of money from the crown. So this, even in our founding here, there's a lot of politics at play. Then 1688 happens, and I mentioned it in the last slide, the Glorious Revolution. James II is overthrown, and William and Mary are brought in to rule. At this point, and the biggest thing I want you to jot down in your notes, at this point, whereas you had the king as kind of the absolute ruler up to this point, or even constitutional ruler. The king's going to kind of take a back seat to Parliament. From this point on, Parliament, okay, the somewhat equivalent, don't kill me for this phrase, the somewhat equivalent to our Congress, right? The kind of the legislature, and they're the ones making the laws. But it's after the Glorious Revolution that really Parliament elevates to really the string pullers. They're the ones that are making the decisions. They're the ones that are leading the British government. And so just understand that. From this point on, what the American colonists are going to be focused on is dealing with Parliament. Now, this doesn't necessarily, I mentioned early on about common myths. You know, we're going to talk a lot about King George, the tyrant. Early on, and in fact, up until midway through the war, their complaint was really with Parliament. It wasn't really to do with the king. The king had kind of taken a back seat. So we'll get into that later on. But that's one of those myths. And what it amounts to, frankly, is kind of propaganda. It's much easier to sell the public on a war against a tyrannical king than it is, this parliamentary system. All right, so we'll get into some of those ins and outs later on. But after the Glorious Revolution, after all this, Parliament is established as kind of the leading political power in Britain. You have some power struggles that happen over here in North America. So, in particular, there was kind of this power struggle between the colonies and Britain. England does fear the fact, as the American colonies start to become more powerful, they do start to fear that they're going to become more independent. And, these ideas of independence, actually do kind of grow for a little bit in the colonies. We'll get to that sentiment later on. But all of this, really this fight between Parliament and the American colonies, we really see the struggle at like a colonial level, right? So basically each colony would have their own legislature that they would create using, American, well, they would have called themselves British, but, people that were born in America or had transferred over here, immigrated to the colonies. So you had these Americans that were in the legislature trying to make laws for their own colonies, but all those laws had to be passed and basically authorized by the royal governors. All right, so the crown, Parliament was selecting who was kind of basically the king of each colony, kind of a mini king, the royal governor, and the legislature really starts bickering in most of these colonies with that royal governor. And as we see more laws coming from Britain, we're going to see that that issue really devolve even further. So just understand that there's this power struggle happening in the colonies, within the British colonies themselves, in which there's this constant struggle between the people and the royal governors. The big catalyst here is between the French and the British, and I'm going to talk more in depth about the French and Indian War on the next slide. But just understand that this is a major catalyst. That when war breaks out between England and France, many Americans are stuck in the middle. And frankly, it was a question on who we would support. There were some that even stated that we should support France and make this, a push for independence. That was not the most popular of viewpoints, and that wasn't, of course, one that would remain. Most people, most colonists, did remain loyal to the British, and that will be the case for a very long time. Even through, you could argue, even at the time of the war itself, there were actually very few, about a third, at least John Adams estimated that, only about a third of the American colonists actually supported the revolution. All right, so about 2/3 were left either supporting Britain or, frankly, not caring. So there's this power struggle happening within the colonies themselves, between them and the British. There's this power struggle between France and Britain over the land. And all of this is going to be exasperated by the last point, salutary neglect. All right, so salutary neglect. We read a little bit about this in our Therapy of Distance reading. If you have not read that, please do so. So what England realizes is that first of all, it's a long ways, right? We often forget that it's a long ways to Britain, especially at this time. Today, we can jump in a plane. A few hours later, we're in England. That was not the case here. I mean, it was months, weeks that it would take to even set sail. So any message that was being sent from Britain to the colonies, to await a response, I mean, it's going to be, months later. So this idea of what's called salutary neglect takes place. So let's define this. This is a major point. I know we've been lecturing a long time, but listen to this. So in an attempt to really not upset the colonies, all right, that was the whole goal of this, the British are going to avoid strictly enforcing their laws, their parliamentary laws in the colonies. All right, so I'll say it again. So salutary neglect. The British are going to basically voluntarily not enforce the laws. That's what it amounts to. So we're setting the stage up to where for really 100 years, if not more, the colonies are going to be able to kind of, in some ways, do what they want, all right, within reason. All right, they're still under the crown, they're still under Parliament, but they're kind of left to do their own thing. As long as you basically keep shipping us goods, keep shipping us, I don't even want to say taxes. They really weren't paying taxes too much at this point. But as long as we keep this trade going, we're seeing the emergence of modern capitalism here. As long as we keep the goods flowing, do what you want. All right, that was kind of the message. That is what salutary neglect was all about. Disregard, really, British laws. Kind of do your own thing as long as you keep making us money. And there's the rub all throughout history. All right, so we're going to briefly talk about the French and Indian War, its effects, and this will be the last part here. So again, the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, you can see there it was fought from 1754 to 1763. I know that's 9 years, so don't get me started on that. But the French and Indian War, how we often call it in America, elsewhere they do call it the 7 Years' War. So the background here, there was this fear of a universal monarchy that Britain was trying to balance power, often through alliances. And usually those alliances centered on limiting the power of France. All right, alliances often switch sides. Spain would be supporting one side and then the other. But the whole focus of what Britain is doing here with the system of alliances that forms is they're trying to limit the growth of the French. They're age-old enemy. So there are a series of wars that take place, major wars between France and Great Britain. You had King William's War. That took place between 1689 1697. You had Queen Anne's War, 1701, 1713. And then you had King George's War, 1744 to 1748. I do want to mention, I guess, quick time out for my students that are watching this. Guys, I am not expecting you to memorize detail like that, okay? That you don't need to know those years. I'm giving you simply context to understand kind of what's happening when. I'm not expecting you to regurgitate that for a test, right? Focus on the big picture here. And, the more small details like that you do know, that's a bonus, right? But don't waste time memorizing, all those little years. Remember, focus on the big events that we'll talk about, and try to get as much detail as possible. But I'm not going to be, checking you on that. Well, let's get to the French and Indian War itself. In some ways, this is really kind of the first world war, if we want to use that as kind of a more liberal definition here. But this war would actually be fought on 5 different continents. Europe, and there's fighting in the Americas, of course. In West Africa, there's fighting. There's fighting in India, in the Philippines. So, it's interesting to see how empire has broadened, our conflicts. Before, in the Middle Ages, between French and the British, it was different invasions and small fighting forces. This is truly a global affair. Now, what's different about the French and Indian War that we're going to talk about is that this is the first one that actually started in North America. All the other ones started basically over in Europe or elsewhere. But this is the first one that kind of started in the colonies, and then the conflict spread over to Europe. I will mention, we'll talk about it later on, but one of the first shots, in fact, I've read articles about how perhaps even the first shot of this war was fired by a young officer for the British Army known by well, later on, he'll take on many different titles, but a young George Washington is actually heavily involved early on in this conflict, getting it started there along the Great Lakes region. Well, anyways, getting ahead of myself. So the war itself, the initial skirmish, like I said, it was literally a 22-year-old George Washington that was involved in this skirmish between British. It was actually from the Virginia colony, and the skirmish with the French. What we're going to see is over the course of the war, and we're not going to get into the battles itself, but the British end up proving stronger, and it goes back to that idea we talked about a few slides ago, the population differences. The French don't have the population there. They don't have the citizenry there because their whole model of empire had been different. It was more, about fur trapping, and you just don't need as many people for that. So they're not transplanting a lot of people to the North American colonies. There are some major cities, modern day, Toronto was known as York back then, but there's going to be some cities that we talk about, especially like the War of 1812 we'll get to. But for the most part, the British had the people, and that's going to make a big difference. So the French are going to rely on Native American support. The Native Americans always pick the wrong side. It just constantly what's happening throughout history. In this case, they align with the French, and it made sense. I mean, the political alignment. I mean, the British had taken a lot more of their land, so they align with France, but they lose and become the biggest losers of this. They get pushed even further west, which will continue on for the next forever. So the British end up winning the Treaty of Paris, and just a little asterisk here, guys. There's a couple treaties of Paris. If you're just doing Wikipedia really quick, you just know that this Treaty of Paris, 1763, was the one that ended the French and Indian War. It laid down a couple of items. I can't remember if I got another. Nope. Couldn't remember if I had another slide there. So jot these down. The things that the Treaty of Paris did. First of all, the British would take possession of all French North America east of the Mississippi River. Okay, so I'll say that again. The British would assume all the French territory east of the Mississippi River, and that included Spanish Florida. The Spanish had come in on the side of the French kind of at the last minute, and they end up losing Florida because of it. Florida will change hands a few times later on, but this is a big deal. The French give Louisiana west of the Mississippi River to Spain as compensation for losing Florida. All right, so France is really the big loser here. They are going to be, for the most part, gone. For the most part, after this, I mean, their people do remain, but the French government is gone until later on in 1800. There's some trading with Spain. Napoleon will get back Louisiana territory and sell it 3 years later. France also had to give up. The possessions in the West Indies. Okay, they called it the West Indies. This is the Caribbean. All right, so they had to give up their territories there, which the British still hold a number of islands in the Caribbean even to this day. So what about those people up in British, now Canada, now British Canada? You have these French people who are just different in every way from the British, right? They don't speak the same language. They don't even really believe in the same type of Christianity, being Catholic for the most part. So if you're Britain, what do you do with these people that are seemingly hostile, but they're very, very sparse, all right? They're not populated in, one center. So what do you do with these people? Britain decided to kind of recognize the same deal that they had with the American colonies. Some salutary neglect here. They basically tell the French citizens in Canada, you can kind of do what you want with religion. They're just trying not to upset them. Listen to this law that gets passed. His Britannic Majesty, on his side, agrees to grant the liberty of the Catholic religion to the inhabitants of Canada. He will, in consequence, give the most precise and most effectual orders that his new Roman Catholic subjects may profess the worship of their religion according to the rites of the Romish Church as far as the laws of Great Britain permit. So Great Britain knows that if they upset the French colonialists up there, they're going to have a real situation on their hands. They do not want French Catholic colonialists allying with the American colonists, and then they lose all of North America. So they're going to try to make the French happy. Okay, they don't have to worry about them as much. They're not, pressing, taxes on them or any of that. Do what you want. We don't want to mess with you. All right, just keep sending pelts our way. So the problem, though, is that this war had been very costly. They've been fighting forever again. So, how do you pay for this war? Well, there's the last point there, letter C. Great Britain will concentrate on ruling America after this. They kind of avoid forcing anything among the French Catholics in the North, and they do begin enforcing some of their laws on America. This is a big change. Salutary neglect ends at this point. Okay, they are going to start forcing laws on America. But remember, Americans have been on their own with salutary neglect really for the last 100 years. They've been doing things their own way. They've developed really their own legislative colonial governments. They're on their own. They've been doing their own system of government. And now all of a sudden Britain's coming in saying, hey, we want you to do it this way, and we want you to pay these taxes. And the Americans are saying, whoa, wait a second. So anyways, revenue collection is going to be the biggest thing. Taxes is going to be, kind of the first impetus to the revolution. I do want to mention something here that I will mention multiple times. It's not the taxes themselves that people disagree with. Okay, a lot of times we, again, take very complex issues, we whittle them down to simple ideas. It was not the taxes themselves that the founding fathers, that the American colonists at the time really had a problem with. It was a lack of representation. No taxation without representation. Okay, so we always forget the first part. They were actually more angry about the representation piece than they were about the taxation. We're going to explain that more in our next lecture. So thank you guys for watching. Hopefully, I'm sorry I went a little long, but is what it is. Got a lot to go through in this class. So as always, guys, please do not hesitate. If you have any questions, email me, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks for tuning in.